the situation with Europe is getting somehow desperate. And I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, maybe ask you, that Europe is Europe using Trump's tariffs as a scapegoat to hide the consequences of its own decisions to cut off, cheap Russian energy?
I don't think the European leaders, Merz and von der Leyen, are trying to use the U.S. As a scapegoat, because it was von der Leyen herself that capitulated to everything that Trump was asking for, the tariff ripoff that he did, the protection racket with Europe. Europe simply surrendered because von der Leyen does not represent the EU voters as a whole. She along with Kaja Kallas, as the EU's foreign ministers, represent NATO. And NATO represents the US neocons. So they're not going to blame the giveaway to America. They're blaming Russia. They're saying we're having to essentially slow European growth because we've had to prevent Russia from dominating us by selling us inexpensive oil and gas to power our industry. We've got to cut ourselves off with Russia. We've got to cut ourselves off with China by not letting any company in Europe that is owned with a majority Chinese influence from operating here. So Europe has declared war on Russia and China. And essentially, Europe has said the reason that we're in a squeeze is we're preparing for war with Russia in 2027. Maybe 2026, maybe 2028. So the attempt is to blame Russia. To blame the U.S. is to blame themselves for completely following the United States, basically. And the solution by blaming Russia is that now they can restructure, using this crisis to restructure the whole industrial economy of the European Union away from what had been the former industrial strength of Germany, France, and other countries in making automobiles, consumer goods, washing machines, refrigerators, all the things that have enabled Germany to become such an industrial export power. They're now changing all this, and they're saying we are now shifting from a consumer economy to a military economy in preparation for the war. And although the EU says, well, our economy is shrinking, now that we're not, they don't say, now that we can't use Russian oil and gas anymore to power our steel mills and our industrial products, we do have essentially one sector that's growing. And the European stock market actually is growing despite the fact that the GDP forecasts are down. And one part of the stock market has been soaring in Europe, and that's the military industrial stocks. Military industrial stocks for the European stock market is what the Silicon Valley Magnificent Seven stocks for the NVIDIA, artificial intelligence, and social media are the United States. They're the leaders because the energy that Europe is able to get, increasingly now imported from the United States, is being diverted to the arms makers. And it's who's going to pay for all this? Well, in the past, the whole European industrial export-oriented economy was based on making profits by exporting, earning the foreign exchange, which has been essentially supporting the euro's exchange rate against the dollar. Well, how is Europe going to do this? Well, there's not really a source of foreign demand anymore because there's no European supply of industrial goods, given the fact that the auto companies are closing down, industrial companies are closing down, glass makers in Germany are closing down, farm equipment makers are laying off workers. So where are they going to get all of the money with all of this? Well, instead of a foreign, they have found a source of foreign exchange, and that's the Russian deposits with Euroclear that are almost 200 billion US dollars, somewhat less for all that. And the idea is to essentially confiscate this money. And they say, we need this money to defend Ukraine as the war goes on for the next 2 years. Well, as all of your other guests unanimously have forecast, the war in Ukraine is not likely to go on for another 2 years. It may be over by next April. And that's the deadline that von der Leyen has set for, well, we've got to make a decision over what to do with the Euroclear money by April. Well, they're pretending that somehow this money has to be given to Ukraine. But of course, you've all seen the scandals about the embezzlement and the corruption of Ukraine as the most corrupt country in Europe and probably in the whole Northern Hemisphere. It's kleptocrats all the way down. So obviously, Europe is not gullible enough to just send these euros that they've seized from Russia to Ukraine. They're going to put it in an escrow fund, and the escrow fund is going to be spent on European arms production. So the money they're giving to Ukraine is given to German, French, and other EU companies to make arms, ostensibly to send to Ukraine, and if not, to fight this war that von der Leyen says we must fight in 2 or 3 years against Russia. Well, this doesn't really make any sense itself. If there is a war with Russia in 3 years, it's not going to use tanks. It's not going to use airplanes. It's not going to be a big, heavy armaments war. It'll probably last only an hour, and it'll be fought by missiles. And there'll be no more European army arms after that occurs. I'm not sure what'll happen in Russia with its defense, but at least if Europe is crazy enough to follow the American advice and said, well, we fought to the last Ukrainian, now let's fight to the last German, French, and last European. Well, if they want to go down that route, that's the route they're going down. But that's the fantasy. That's the disconnect that we have between fantasy and reality that's going on now. And it's all about the narrative. How can they make a narrative to justify this huge giveaway to the military-industrial complex that seems to be the most powerful lobbyist in Europe, backed by their neocon counterparts in the United States? So this is Europe's military and economic suicide drive.
Richard, here is what the Chief of General Staff of France said just today. He said that the French must be prepared to lose their own children. What Michael has said, it's all about the militarization of Europe, and whoever out there wants Europe to be a powerhouse, the last thing they want to do would be militarization of Europe, because that the history says that to us. If they go in that direction, after all, eventually they're going to fight each other instead of fighting Russia, in my opinion. And when it comes to Europe and the growth of their economy, how much of Europe's sub 1% growth is truly caused by Washington, and how much is a structural decline made in Brussels?
Well, let me comment on this whole conversation. It's always the simple answer is it's always a mixture. It's always a mixture of what the Europeans do in and of and for themselves and how they cope with the larger world of which they are a part. And they are a part not because of anybody else but them. It's Europe that during its colonialist phase, several centuries old, brought the world together. Marx repeatedly explains to us that part of the historic function of capitalism has been to create a world market. And that, when he says that, he means European capitalism, which was the chief agency for doing that. So European development has always been dependent on its global expansion. If I can remind you of the old Hegel discussion when he talks about the relationship between the master and the slave, you might think it's only the slave who depends on the master. But when you have a slave who does everything for you, you become a slave of your slave, which is the brilliance of Hegel explaining the dialectic. Europe, therefore, has always been a slave of the rest of the world, which it made into slaves. It's not either or, it is this entwinement, and they can't get away from it. In the post World War II period, the last 75 years, the Europeans became utterly dependent on the United States because they destroyed each other in the idea that by winning World War II, whatever that might mean, they would escape their slavery. They didn't. The slaves slaughtered each other, and then they all bowed down before the United States. And mostly the people that we're seeing now, and this is very important, von der Leyen, Ruta, all of them, are people whose entire lifetimes, their growing up as children, their university years, their power positions as they rose to the bureaucracy, have been steeped in one overwhelming reality, and that is a slavish dependence on the United States. So they cannot, even when it is handed to them on a platter, they cannot turn against what they have been busily working for all their lives. And I bet you, I don't know these people, but I bet you if you gave them a few drinks and you had a conversation, they would tell you all the ways in which the United States helped them, lifted them up, boosted them through their careers, all the rest of it. So here comes Mr. Trump, who smacks them in the face, who declares war on them with his tariffs and his trade wars, who announces that he doesn't care about them, that they have been it's like parents who disown their children. Instead of the Europeans being our allies, they have cheated us. They have exploited us. They are horrible, these Europeans. So here's the slave being denounced by the master and being hit by tariffs. When Michael mentions how von der Leyen gave away everything, let me remind everyone what she did. She committed the Europeans for the next 10 years, I believe, to be dependent on liquefied natural gas purchased from the United States at a price which, the last time I looked, was 2 to 3 times the cost for energy from what they had gotten from Russia. In addition, she committed the Europeans to invest $750 billion in the United States. So let's be very clear. She committed European politicians like herself to the task of persuading the voters in Europe that they should support using the $750 billion not to create jobs for them, not to build their economy, not to solve their problems, not to fund their social safety net, but to do that for the United States. That is a spectacular procedure in which a slavish Europe falls on its own sword after being denounced and attacked by the tariffs. And remember, all of those things that von der Leyen agreed to, she agreed to in exchange for lowering the tariffs from the high level initially announced by Trump to a lower level, I believe around 15%. Well, I mean, it is beyond words. And it is so grotesque that it gives you immediately a psychological insight. The demonization of Russia is the displacement of the rage and anger against the United States. That is the problem. The real danger, the real threat, the real burden, and the real oppression of Europe is now being carried out by Mr. Trump. But because of the relationship, they can't say so. They can't bring it to their own brain. They act even on the television in front of their own people, they act out the slavery. That's how desperate they are. And the other side of that coin is the absolute demonization of Russia. You have to heap onto Russia all of the hostility, all of the rage you feel from Trump but can't discuss. You know, it's very classic in psychology. It's called projection. It has other words where you carry through an emotion you cannot control, but you target another person. It's the idea behind scapegoating. It's here in the United States. We have all these problems, but we get very angry at immigrants. It's ridiculous because it is a projection, and it's not the solution to the problem, it's the evasion. Having said all of that, I don't see in Europe yet any break in the political elite from basically continuing this policy. The danger in Europe comes from below. On the right, it is the horror of what this is doing to the nationality of Europe.